Hi there, and welcome everybody to this webinar on food security and the question, how low can we go in terms of can food production reach net zero by 2050? I'm going to introduce a fantastic set of panelists in a moment. Before I go on to that, just a little bit of housekeeping information, just to let you know that the audience, your microphones and cameras will be kept off throughout, and please note that the event is being recorded. You're welcome, however, to use the Q&A function to raise questions for the panel, and we can view these at any moment during the course of the discussions. So please be prepared to enter some questions there, and we'll try to tackle those in the general discussion at the end. And then finally, this is a webinar that's being organised by the Cambridge Global Food Security Interdisciplinary Research Centre, and it's a part of a series called Food for Thought panel events, and you can find out more details on our website. Okay, well, without further ado, we've got three of our panelists present, and we're hoping that Emma will be able to join us. I'd like to introduce you to Professor Sarah Bridle, who's the chair in Food, Climate and Society at the University of York, an interesting transdisciplinary background, but notably she's recently published a book about food and climate change without the hot air, which of course resonates to some extent with another tome in terms of energy and so on. So really interesting. We've also Sophie Atwood, who is at the World Resources Institute, which is a climate think tank, and there she's working on the food program, and she's a behavioral scientist, and so got an insight into how we can switch to healthier foods. Adam Pellegrini is an associate professor in the Department of Plant Sciences here in Cambridge, and he's basically a soil scientist, but is particularly interested in climate change and impacts on soil and soil dynamics, and it particularly will tell us a little bit about potential for how production can potentially contribute to reaching net zero. And then finally, welcome. We've now got Emma, who's managed to join us after having to reboot her computer. Now she's a researcher in health behaviour at LEAP in Oxford, and she also has long-standing interests, and as a former graduate of of Cambridge as well, in shifting behaviour to a plant-based diet. So welcome, all of you. So to start with, we're going to have some short presentations from each of our panelists. And Sophie, is that okay if I start with you to begin with? And I'm not sure whether you want to share your screen or whether you just wish if you've got any slides to present. But I'll hand over to you for your short thoughts on the key questions raised by this whether we can reach net zero by 2050.
Thank you, Howard. No, I didn't make any slides, so sorry. Just be me talking at the screen. So we were asked to give our thoughts on how low can you go? Can food production reach net zero? And kind of reflecting on this today, I think my general case is, unfortunately, I'd like to be optimistic, but my answer is no, probably not. Going through kind of the data that I've seen on the topic, and also working in this area for about 5 years now, and looking at the pace at which change seems to be happening, it's kind of not really happening quick enough. So we're seeing some progress towards a more sustainable food system, but really it's in the time frame that we need to reach net zero. We're not getting there really at the speed we need to. My work specifically, as Howard mentioned, is on the behavioural side. So I look at consumer demand and demand for more sustainable diets. The big thing that we focus on is trying to encourage a reduction in the amount of ruminant meat that's consumed, because of all the products you can eat. Ruminant meat's the one with the really big environmental footprint and produces the most GHG emissions, which obviously is the big thing for net zero. To summarise really where I think we're at kind of on that agenda is that we have seen some progress in recent years towards a reduction in emissions from beef specifically. So we've seen between where data is available between 2015 and 2020, a reduction in high consuming regions, which is important. It's been around 2% or 91 calories per person per day. So that's really great, but 2% is a relatively small decline in a relatively small proportion of the population. So if we project that rate of progress forward, really, as I've said, it's not kind of enough, quick enough. And it's also in the kind of set in a global context, really where we see rapidly increasing demand for meat and for ruminant meat, particularly in many other areas of the world. Many developing countries, as populations grow, we're expected to reach 10 billion people on the planet by 2050. Many of these economies are transitioning, so they're becoming more developed, higher incomes. If we think about areas like Asia and Africa, as this happens, we do tend to see a transformation in the diet, moving towards higher protein consumption and greater demand for meat. So when we really look at forward projections on meat consumption in many of the developing countries, we see the intake levels will vastly exceed the recommended thresholds. They're already being exceeded in many developed countries, and that increase will really wash out pretty much any progress that we're making currently in the developed world to cut our consumption levels, which is all quite depressing, really. I think the kind of a further issue I see on the topic is that progress is slow, but we also still don't have the impetus that we need behind this agenda. On the research side, which is where I spend a lot of my time, lots of progress has happened. So we do now have quite a clear idea from the consumer perspective on how we can get change to happen. And that's really great to see. But the translation of that research into kind of policy at the national and international level doesn't seem to be happening in quite the way it needs to get an accelerated change. So if we have a look at many national strategies on food, we see that kind of many of our really high impact behavioural changes that we could recommend aren't being included in these strategies, and quite a few more outdated approaches like information campaigns are still being recommended as the kind of go-to actions to take. So that's likely to be impeding progress, and we definitely need to do a better job of getting the message out there on what really works. Just to give an example, if we think about the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which are the major strategy documents that countries have to put forward, that lays out what they will do to try to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is trying to keep climate change to ideally under 2 degrees increase in temperature. We, for example, conducted an analysis recently of the NDCs to have a look at all the different behavioural policies they featured, specifically looking at food among these. And we looked at the top 20 highest emitting countries just to give an example to see what was there. And interestingly, what we found is that very few of these featured shifts in diets as a recommended strategy. So we know this to be one of our biggest levers for change to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't even feature in most of these national strategies. There's a little bit on food waste. China's doing some quite interesting things to be applauded, but we didn't find hardly anything on sustainable diets. And I think one of the only countries to feature plant-based as a recommendation was Ethiopia, which is, as you can imagine, not a country with a huge environmental footprint. So just to give a snapshot there really of where we're at, is kind of quite worrying at this stage in the game. There is some progress kind of at the national level, not represented in the NDCs. We have, for example, some national strategies beginning to come through around diet, which really are quite promising. I think there was one published about last week from Denmark, which is really praised for being a really forward-thinking strategy. I saw today South Korea have their national diet strategy come out. So there is actions on the national level, but we're really at a point where this should be happening everywhere. It should be happening in much more cohesive way, and it really should be happening in countries that are with very high consumption rates of products that are high emitters like beef. So that includes places like Australia, the US, Argentina, and Brazil. So we need much more action, much more quickly. So yeah, we're in a situation in 2023 where we're in a world that's rapidly warming. We do have quite good insight now on what works. We just really need to rapidly introduce those insights and get change to happen at a lot quicker pace. So that's that's where I'm sorry to be the downer, but hopefully that some other panelists can offer some optimism. I think you're on mute, Howard. Apologies.
Howard, you're still on mute.
Sorry, can I move over to, can I move over to Adam now? Thanks, Sophie. I was just saying, great to get that global perspective. Adam, from the production perspective, what are your thoughts on reaching net zero?
Well, I think I'm equally pessimistic that it probably won't hit net zero in the time required, but I do think there are a lot of opportunities and knobs that can be turned to reduce emissions as well as increase carbon dioxide removal. So obviously, the food system is a massive player in climate change. It's around a third of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And within the food system itself, a little over half, a little bit less than 2/3 of the emissions come from what's happening on the farm. So how a manager is feeding its cows, how it's tilling its field, how much fertilizer it's applying, et cetera. And if you look across, thousands of different studies that have assessed the carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions of different food products, you can see this massive amount of variability in the relative emissions, even within a single product like beef, for example, which I won't speak much about because Sophie knows way more about it than I do. But taking beef as an example, you can see this huge spread in the amount of emissions, and that spread can arise due to all the different aspects of what's happening on the farm that contributes greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So in some cases, it may be due to the enteric fermentation that with the cow and the methane that it's produced. And that can be changed by altering the type of feed, altering whether or not it's grazing, etc. In another case, it may have to do with how manure is being managed, and that can change as well and be either changed by the farmer or changed at a government level. So the data are out there to tell us at least what are some of the practices that currently exist that we could be promoting to reduce emissions without necessarily changing a dietary preference per se, in terms of if you just care about your 100 grams of beef a day, well, there's a lot of swing in the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted with that. The other component is looking at carbon dioxide removal. And so that would have to do with things like cover cropping, reduced tillage, altered grazing management, biochar addition, all these things that have really become hot button topics. People are getting paid to do them. Companies are getting started up to help fund farmers to do them. And one big component of my work is evaluating whether or not they're actually impactful and practical. And I think that the upper bound limits proposed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change show these things have huge potential to sequester carbon. And unfortunately, within that, the uncertainties are very high, almost an order of magnitude. So you have this process that can potentially reduce emissions by increasing sequestration that's very unconstrained. So I think that that's an area that really needs a more in-depth look, because as governments begin to roll out policies to promote regenerative farming, they really need to figure out what they should be promoting and by how much. So I do think that there's some opportunities, but we still need to improve on the science from the carbon dioxide removal standpoint. And aside from that, I don't have much other good news to say. Thanks, Howard.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam. That's given us again a kind of a very clear steer from the producer side, and I think we can come back to maybe ask you some more questions about what you mentioned there. An interesting sounding concept, regenerative farming, and I think nature-based solutions is another one that gets bounced around. So maybe we'll get some questions, or we'll come back to think about that. Let's move on to Emma next. If that's okay, Emma, welcome. And I know you've been interested in consumer-based responses and nudging in the past. So tell us what your current thoughts are.
Oh, many current thoughts. Good evening, everyone. Can food production reach net zero? This is, of course, a really important question, and it's a great one for a panel discussion. And thank you all for being here. I think it's almost the wrong question. We are going to have to reach net zero food production one way or another. And the question is, as Sophie and Adam have both alluded to, how much societal disruption and human suffering are we going to go through before we get there? Will a net zero food production, will those societies look recognizable to today's societies, or will they look completely different? As I'm sure we could all agree, it's not a binary yes, no, we reach net zero or we don't. It's about staying at net zero. So this is quite cliched, but it's a journey, not just a destination. Even when we get there, we have to stay there, and we need to get there as soon as possible, of course. There are so many things that we can do and that our governments could be doing. And although there are some technological improvements which would be great, well, many in fact, but this isn't the main barrier. It's political and societal will. There is a brilliant climate writer based in the US called Mary Anais Hagler, and she wrote a fantastic piece called Home is Always Worth It, which I thoroughly recommend. And to paraphrase some of the things she says in that, I've never seen a perfect world, and I never will. But I know that a world warmed by 2 degrees is preferable to a world warmed by 3, 4, or 5. And I will fight for that with all that I have, because Earth is all that I have. We need to slash meat consumption in high and middle income countries. We need to slash food waste. We need a circular economy within our food system that prioritizes human health and sustainability rather than profit. We need to remove fossil fuels from across our societies and from our food system, from fishing ship fuel to tractor fuel. We have to reduce the land footprint of our diets too, from less meat and more beans and lentils to possibly exploring technologies like cultured meat and precision fermentation. And with that freed up land, we can sequester more carbon and return it to nature. And to return to the discussion of optimism versus pessimism, I'd like to share a quote. David Attenborough, I heard him say it, and he quoted someone. I can't find the original speaker, so they'll have to forgive me. It doesn't matter whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I can see the problem and I feel compelled to act. And personally, I find this incredibly liberating. So don't feel like you have to choose between team optimism or team pessimism. Just, do what you can and act in your home, in your communities. Let's focus on decarbonizing our food system as safely and as rapidly as possible. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. That's a great call there. So I think a phrase I used to use at various panels in the past is say no to NIMBYism. Do it in your own backyard. So anyway, right. Well, enough of me. It's now great to be able to introduce Sarah Bridle, as I mentioned before, who's been giving us lots of background information on diets and their greenhouse gas emissions. So, Sarah, what are your thoughts in this general area?
Well, I mean, what a great introduction already. So just to sort of try and add a few things, I would just like to also point out that we don't just need food production to reach net zero, we need food production to go beyond net zero, because actually overall we need net zero with all the other things like aviation that are going to be happening presumably anyway. So all of the reports, for example, at Committee on Climate Change will require the food system to actually go way beyond net zero in order to make up for the other activities that we're doing. So it's definitely a hard task. I mean, we talked about changes in production and consumption, so I'll just comment a bit on what's been said. But I think that, I mean, Emma raised this point about land use, and that came up in some of Sophie and Adam's comments as well about land use. And really, this is the key in terms of getting to net zero, because of course, as Adam's explained already, that we can use the land to sequester carbon. And as Emma said, you know, there's, for example, rewilding is one way that we can use that land to sequester carbon. And just to illustrate the scale of the issue, I mean, people sort of worry because they say if we use land for sequestering carbon, we're then going to not have enough food. But actually, this is really a big misunderstanding of the situation, that actually about 80% of the land globally that's used for agriculture is used to produce food that's fed to animals. But that actually produces, it takes about 16 times as much land to produce 1 calorie of animal-based products compared to 1 calorie of plant-based products. And if you do the sums, that means that we actually have to increase our, in extreme case, if everybody went vegan, which I'm not proposing, but just to illustrate the scale of the potential of diet change, we need to produce a bit more plants. So actually we need 25% of the land to produce plants, and we'd free up 75% of the land for other uses. And if we use that land for sequestering carbon, for example, with forests, then we would be able to sequester enough carbon to cover our diets and other uses. So just to illustrate, you know, one possible way that the food system can totally reach net zero and beyond. We could talk about whether I'm pessimistic or optimistic, or maybe we don't need to. I mean, I've started working a bit more on potential catastrophes that might happen in the food system, because I feel like, as Emma's said, you know, it's going to change one way or the other, and the big question is whether we're being a proactive part of that or whether that's just happening to us. And we surveyed 58 food system experts, and 80% of them thought that it was possible that we would have major civil unrest in the next 50 years. And then we asked them about the causes of that, and more than half of those people thought that if it was due to food, then it would be just due to there not being enough food in the UK. And the others thought it might be to do with there not being a sufficient distribution of food within the UK due to, for example, not being able to get the food around the place. So it's definitely a question of trying to figure out how we build back better. You know, it doesn't mean to say we just sit back and wait for bad things to happen. We can say, what's that plan going to be when things get worse? You know, how do we make sure that we build back better rather than building back fast, which is what's been happening so far. So yeah, I think there's a huge amount of potential. I think that you know, it's been alluded to as well. I feel like in the question, how low can you go, it implies that all of the participants on this call should go home and, you know, try and change their diets. But I think what we're all talking about is systemic change, about how do we change the way that the food system is set up so that we can then move towards net zero. And that really comes down then to, you know, what's the political will has been said, but we need to bring consumers along with that, because actually, for example, we couldn't have a sugary drinks tax if we didn't have a general comprehension that, for example, sugary drinks are causing health problems like type 2 diabetes. So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of engaging consumers, but it's actually not for the reasons that most people think. It's in order to get that pressure to get the systemic change. And I shall stop there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarah. That final point you raised there. And again, I suppose the one thing that's none of you have really come out to say, but is implicit in your final comments, relate to the extent that we could have well, government policies which could actually drive us or shift us or nudge us towards some of these goals. You mentioned the sugar tax, which has had some success, but again, my understanding is that it's been largely watered down to some extent from what the actual food scientists would have preferred. So I guess that's one of the big problems. So now I don't think we've got any questions in the chat. So perhaps I'd just like to ask you all whether you've mentioned a number of issues, but one of the things that you haven't talked about are extreme climatic events, and we're about to see another storm hitting the south coast. So to what extent do you think that these extremes, be it the intense heat that we've had in the UK for several summers over the last year, relative to now the intense precipitation we're getting, very focused in particular areas of the UK, how much this could drive the sustainability plans off course? Who'd like to come in on that? Okay, Adam, I'm going to ask Adam to comment on that then.
Okay. So when you first started talking about this, immediately what I thought of was globalization. And the reason for that is because I think you need to have enough of a supply of food from different areas that may be not experiencing these catastrophic events at the same time. So that obviously comes with costs, right? There's higher transport in order to bring food to consumers. But I think that you can also find, creative ways of figuring out how do we reduce the overall climate risk of food production. I mean, from my basic understanding of agricultural production models, they do a reasonable job with looking at potential production change. And so you can get some idea for, okay, depending on the location in the globe, where might we see the largest effects? And as a consequence, make sure that we don't take the really, robust areas totally out of production. Now, the trade-off would come into, well, what if that's an area that could be tropical rainforest and store a lot of carbon? Or what if that area is peatland that could be restored? So I do think you come into these potential collision, it comes in into a collision course with reducing emissions, but I think we have the tools to be strategic with that and at least foresee some of it.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam. Would anybody, Emma, please come in.
Yes, I just wanted to kind of echo Adam's point, and that I sometimes see some people argue that globalization is very bad for food security, and then sort of just eat local, sort of seeing LinkedIn and other websites. And I think there are some really terrible assumptions in that. The idea that UK production will be relatively unscathed, and that, other places will have, badly disrupted food systems. And so therefore we shouldn't import things from those places. I think exactly as Adam says that, we need some trade and globalization so that places and regions and countries which have one bad year can import food from elsewhere and return the favor in subsequent years. I think extreme weather events are a huge challenge and threat to our food system, of course. And I think in terms of resilience looking into the future, we need as many tools in our toolbox as possible. And I'm not an expert on these, but things like, cultured meat or precision fermentation, which aren't relying on the seasons and weather to the same extent as if you were growing livestock and crops in fields, I think could be really important as having some resilience to those extreme events. And so that we're not reliant on spring, summer, autumn, winter behaving in certain ways in certain places, because that is all heading out of the window, sadly. You're muted, Howard.
Sorry, guys. I'll never get the hang of this modern communications business. Okay, Sophie, Sarah, can I move on to bring in one of the questions that's come up in the chat, which I think there's a couple of really interesting ones that have come in. The first one is about how much business is, which picks up on some of the comments about globalization, but how much does business sort of sway political will and willingness to take us to where we need to be? So perhaps I could come to you for Sophie. Come to you.
It's got a complicated answer to that, because the answer is like, yes, it does. I remember, this is totally anecdotal, but a couple of years ago, talking to somebody who worked at the Pulse board in the US, the board that kind of oversees the pulse industry, like legumes, chickpeas, etc. And they were explaining to me how a lot of the research had mentioned that pulses are really good for health, and they'd recommended a really high quantity in the diet. I can't remember what it was, but something like kind of 12 cups a week of pulses. And that recommendation had gone out, and the dairy lobby in the US had lobbied so hard that they'd removed that all the way down to one or two cups of pulses, and it replaced with dairy as a recommendation. And if you look at the US National Dietary Guidelines, they still have, for example, like a glass of this insane amount of milk in the dietary guidelines. So even a document that's supposed to be a fixed science-based recommendation of intake for health is highly shaped by kind of different forces. I mean, most of the food products you eat have you know, evolved out of what can be farmed easily. And then you breakfast cereals, another example, you know, it gets sold at really high, sold as a kind of high fiber, healthy option, but that didn't really exist, you know, 50 years ago. It came with the advent of cereal farming, and then they had to do something with those products. So it is highly influenced, but on the flip side, the food industry, I'm not kind of not necessarily talking about lobby groups, but it's also a massive tool for change. And there is many entities in the food industry who are doing amazing, really inspiring things. And I've been lucky enough to work with quite a few of these companies, particularly in food service, and like the will to do things is really strong. And there's a lot of kind of interesting creative efforts from chefs, retailers. Have made really, especially in the UK, really big strides on tackling food waste. A lot of product innovation. There's the whole of the alt protein industry. There's many industries that are looking at repurposing and reformulating food products for a number of reasons. So it's a bit of both, really. So I think there's kind of good and bad in there. So sorry, it's an anecdotal story, but first one that came to mind.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, your thoughts?
Yeah, yes, definitely. It's a big issue, and I think just to build on what Sophie said, I think that actually businesses tend to have a longer term view than governments actually on what's going to happen. You know, they're planning for, let's say, the next 10, 20 years. They're concerned about the food risk, the risks to the food system, potential catastrophic risks. In perhaps a slightly longer term way than the government. So, you know, they actually, if they think that we're going to have, for example, climate related financial incentives in the next 10 years, they want to be building towards that. And so actually, from their point of view, often it's more about, are we going to have a level playing field relative to other businesses, and how do we get to that place? For example, I'm on the eco working group of the Food Data Transparency Partnership, which is one of the tangible things to come out of the government's food strategy response to the Dimbleby review. And you know, the point of that group is to really agree on those reporting standards that are going to be used when companies quote their food greenhouse gas emissions, so that at least there's one methodology that can be used. And that's really helpful for businesses so that they can be on a level playing field. It's not necessarily going to change the world in its own right to have that agreed standard, but you couldn't have, for example, the sugary drinks tax if we didn't have an agreed way of measuring the amount of sugar in products. So I think it's a necessary first step for any kind of financial incentives, for example.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I quite agree. I think it's very much, I think when industries recognise the threat to their bottom line, there will be increasingly pressure for us to help to adopt policies. Now, we had another really interesting question that came in about what you individually would feel would be the single most important government policy that needs to happen to transform our food system, and so that's a government policy. And then what's the best thing we as individuals can do to change our response? So I'll go around you all again. I'll come to Emma first of all.
Yes, great question. I'll slightly dodge it by saying obviously there's no silver bullet, but for me it's very much fiscal and economic policies. So we have to price things according to their environmental damage, and that comes along with reducing inequality between nations and within nations. So it's not just lower income people who are getting hammered and the rich can carry on eating as much beef as they like, but redirecting subsidies away from livestock, which is much more publicly acceptable than a meat tax, even though they have quite similar effects, and redirecting those towards legumes, fruits and vegetables will be absolutely key. So I think those big economic levers are really what we need. And on an individual level, I would say learn how to cook 1 or 2 really delicious vegan meals with plenty of protein, and then share them with your friends and get them trying them as well. And so just think about, we all, you know, influence and are influenced by our friends and colleagues and people around us. So, you know, or choose a restaurant with the good vegetarian options and take your friends there. Make it normal. I'm really proud of my parents for when they have dinner parties, and this is, you know, rural Somerset, they have you know, vegan options with people who are used to having kind of quite a big piece of meat is what you do when you're entertaining guests. And so changing the norms that way, I'd recommend that.
Thanks, Emma. Come to you, Adam. Government policy, what would you recommend?
So I was going to say carbon tax, and that's because I think, similar to what Emma was getting at, you can have a lot of things change when you turn the screws on something from the top down, and potentially motivate big companies that manage suppliers to change who they're either sourcing from or what the supplier does, and thus reduce emissions. I think there's a whole load of issues that pop up when you begin to talk about carbon taxes. However, like where does that burden fall on? You know, do all people have to pay the same amount of tax, or what do you do if you're disadvantaged, et cetera, et cetera? Now that's way above my pay grade and outside of my specialty. So I'll say that's a problem for somebody else. But I do think that there's ways of things like redistributing the revenue that comes from a tax to people that may not be able to afford to pay more for food. You know, there are things that we can do. As far as personal components to reduce emissions, I don't think I'm a very good poster child for that. I'm not vegan or vegetarian, but I do eat a lot of pasta. And go pretty meat free. Judging by my last name, that probably doesn't surprise many of you. But for me, honestly, what I did was I cut out beef for the most part from my diet, and I think that there's a lot of other good substitutes there, and it was pretty easy for a behavioral change.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Sophie?
I'd probably go down the behavioural route in answering that. We've actually done a piece of work lately to review all the different behavioural levers. It was a business focused piece of work, but it kind of applies, you know, the same levers can be applied in a policy context. And what comes out really is the things that work really well are massively increasing the availability of good quality, really tasty plant-based options. So it's a kind of carrot, not stick approach. If you swamp people's choice environment with the thing you want them to choose, they will choose it. And at the same time, kind of resetting the defaults. So you really wanted to try to remove beef from the menu as a default option, or make it a lot harder for people to access. How that would translate to policy, I'm not sure. It could be a mandate on number of the ratio of vegetarian to non-vegetarian dishes, or the number of a specific mandate on days per week where meat can be sold. The issue is some of these things would be very, very highly unpopular, so and create backlash. So we need to be a bit careful about that. But there's definitely things that work there. And I think from the perspective of individual recommendations, it's really going to echo what everyone else is saying. The single thing, if you really wanted to distill it down, is just avoid cows. Anything from a cow. So white meat, the impact isn't as bad. Pork, it's not as bad. Fish is kind of relatively okay. Plant-based is obviously the best. But if you're going to do any one thing, just try to cut down the amount of beef and dairy that you eat, really simply. And I think Emma mentioned something really nice, which is modeling the change. So I've been vegetarian all my life, and it's been really interesting watching the difference in response to when 15 years ago I used to tell people that, to like 5 years ago, and now to now. It seems to be, for example, people don't like being told what to do, but if you can sit there and kind of model it, you know, without a very strong agenda, people do tend to kind of pick up on the benefits of eating in that specific way. And there are many benefits for health as well. So cut the cows and eat veggie in front of people.
Okay, thanks very much, Sophie. Sarah, your thoughts?
I'll just be very quick because I totally agree with everything that's been said. Yeah, I definitely agree. Financial incentives can be very unpopular. I think it's important that they are proportional to climate impacts to help incentivize producers who are doing good things, even if they are producing meat. But you know, it doesn't have to be just a tax. It could be reducing existing subsidies to livestock production, but also subsidising the healthy, sustainable choices with, you know, if it was a revenue neutral tax that we subsidise and tax, then I think that would be more popular. individual. Well, I think one thing I was surprised about when I did the research into the impacts is that actually, like a tin of, oh, you can't see it, tin of beans. You don't have to boil your beans up all night. You know, if you have beans in a tin, then it's very easy to just add them to things. So bulking out with beans and chickpeas and lentils, these things, you don't necessarily change the flavour massively if you add a couple of tins, but the fact that you've got packaging there isn't actually nearly as bad as most people think, because it's recyclable, and it's not nearly as bad as I thought it was when I first looked into it.
Brilliant. Thanks for your prompt responses there. I've got a couple of questions, and I'm going to merge two of them, because there's one, and thanks to, I'm not able to name many of you who are making really important points in the chat, which we are taking note of. Thank you for those. It's really interesting to see them coming in. I'm trying to keep up with you as you go through. There was a question about what would be the most useful intervention to reduce the carbon footprint of food, and that was followed by one a little later, which was about their frustration with the lack of the handling food waste in various areas. And I just thought we could merge those two together and get you to go comment perhaps on this whole idea of our individual carbon footprint from and managing food waste. What are your thoughts that we could on what actions we should take there, or we should encourage local governments and local councils to take there? Yeah, Emma, please.
I can try and answer this one. First of all, just saw that question, and good for you for doing all you can to reduce food waste, and much sympathy for all the frustrations and barriers you're coming across. But you know, good for you, and cheering you on here from Oxford. I think I'm not such an expert in this in terms of what you can do as an individual. I don't know if your street could have like a compost bin. I imagine, you know, there could be some issues with sort of potentially rats or hygiene. I'm not sure. But if there's things on small scales that could happen, in terms of local boroughs not collecting food waste, there will be local elections next year. Find out who's standing in your area if you have time, and find out who would actually push for stuff on food waste and offer to leaflet for them, you know, or volunteer. And I think we are very likely to have a change in government at some point in the next 12 months. And that is a real kind of window of opportunity to push things. But in terms of things like food waste, local council and borough policies are so important. So finding a councillor or candidate who's willing to engage with you on that is key. And yeah, I'm involved a bit with local politics, and from talking with friends, it's amazing how much a persistent individual can shift councillors' priorities. So good luck to you. Okay,
thanks Emma. We'll move on. I think it's really good to have an expert like yourself tackling that particular area. There's another question came in about how translating policy outputs into actionable plans. So that's my lights, I think, that is just on the blink. And the question there would be, how can we bridge between policy, between both production and consumption? And I think the key thing that I know that that Francesca and the Food Security Initiative were keen to marry together through this discussion was the balance between both the individuals and our consumption, but also the bigger picture about food production. So how can we get to actionable plans on that? And I'll just go and sort my lights out. Who'd like to come in on that? Sophie, can I?
Howard looks like he's in a rave, and he's some glow sticks. Tricky question, and I'm not sure I've necessarily got the answer to all of it. I think one angle I have seen done and kind of touched upon is trying to get scientific evidence into the hands of policymakers so they can use it. And I think this is sometimes things that if you're in a research role, which I presume some of the audience here are, is a challenge in translating work that is conceptually interesting into something that has policy relevance. And that is really, I think largely the responsibility of researchers to get better at, because there's a lot of amazing insights held in academia that probably would be adopted, but they need to be communicated, probably through different forums and in different ways. And I think what seems to work quite well, and because I've done a fair amount of work trying to kind of communicate science to also lay audience and consumers, is people do generally understand concepts, but they need to be very, very, very much simplified and graphical formats, really. So if you're a researcher and you want to get your work kind of out and featured, if you can ever distill it down into a single graphic or image, that is a really powerful thing to do, because that can get communicated really easy on kind of social media and stuff. So I think from the link between the research into the policy, it's a communications challenge, and it's one I think that we need to get better at, really, to try to accelerate that. The link between production and consumption is something I can't answer, so I'll hand over to another panelist.
Well, can I just respond on that comment that Sophie made, because I think that was a really interesting point. In fact, there was an article just came out in Nature Food last week, which again you can't see because of my background, but Tim Benton has weighed in on this about how academics could do more to disrupt and reframe the solution space for food system transformation. But just to comment on that I think that there is a sort of perception in academia, and I wonder how many of the participants are from academia. There tends to be a perception in academia that we need to produce gold-plated research which builds, in a really thorough way on the previous research, and actually what we need today, we don't have time for that in terms of the food system transformation. So I think that there's a lot that funding agencies are starting to do in terms of the way that they actually frame what is research and the way that they give out grants. But I think the universities have some way to go as well in actually recognising the policy work and not necessarily requiring, a sort of gold-plated research paper that takes 3 years to write, takes 1 year to go through a refereeing process and is then behind a paywall. It's actually completely unfit for the purpose that we need to be addressing.
Thanks very much. I'm gonna move on, if I may. I'm gonna Adam. There's one here for you. Somebody's asked, well, what do we mean by regenerative farming? So perhaps you could just give a quick summary of the principles associated with that, and also another comment. I know we've discussed in the past is nature-based solutions.
Okay, two big things for a late night brain. The first one with regenerative, I mean, that can mean a whole slew of things, but I think from the perspective of carbon emissions, the idea would be doing something where you would either reduce your emissions or you would increase the sequestration, so the carbon dioxide removal, and as a consequence, net emissions should go down. Now, there's a number of different pathways that have been proposed to do this. Some of the biggest ones in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions would be things like cover cropping, carbon sequestration in cropland soils. Sorry, I'll take a step back. Carbon sequestration in cropland soils is one of the big ones, as well as carbon sequestration in pasture lands. So those are two of some of the biggest carbon dioxide removal knobs with regenerative agriculture. And within each of those, you have a number of different management strategies. So within croplands, it's thought that cover cropping can be good because it increases inputs into the soils. Now, there's a major study happening in Europe where they're evaluating the efficacy of cover cropping for soil carbon sequestration. And then they're integrating that into what might cover cropping actually contribute to reducing net greenhouse gas emissions in the food sector. And what they found is that it's actually pretty minimal, though it varies quite a bit country to country. So regenerative agriculture, I'd say, very useful concept. It can be related to greenhouse gas emissions and can help guide, potential pathways to reduce emissions, but is very context specific in its efficacy. And then, do you want me to go into the nature-based solutions one? Because I've been talking for some time now.
Maybe come back to that, because there are some other areas, and I think I'd like the panel to contribute to some of these. There's been a couple of questions that I think is we're making some interesting points about we've talked about developing countries and the way that their diets are likely to change as there is an increase in affluence and a general shift towards increased meat consumption. And one of the questioners actually questioned that, and I think we should come back to sort of explain why we think that that is likely. And there's another one which is also saying it's all very well getting developing countries or persuading them to adopt more sustainable solutions, but if this is going to be more expensive, can they really afford this? And so how are we actually going to incentivize these sustainable solutions in developing countries? So there's two elements there. Who'd like to go first on that? Anybody like to put your hand up? Sophie, you look
ready. Yeah, there's quite an interesting analysis that came out last year looking at exactly this question in the context of the Eat Lancet planetary health diet, which is the big the first and kind of most, I guess, well-researched plant-based diet. And they analyzed how much it would cost a day to follow that diet, something like equivalent of $2.60 a day. So obviously if you live in the developed world, that's a really minor proportion of daily household income, so it's affordable. It does presume a few things like you know how to cook and you know how to cook the recipes in the diet, which is quite a big thing. But that $2.60 a day is unaffordable for something like 1.58 billion people worldwide. And there's been additional kind of critiques of the diet in that it may lack certain nutrients that are required by populations who may have deficiencies in certain areas because of like poor access to different food. So there is a big debate around that topic, and the response from then on has been to try to evolve those recommendations so they're culturally contextualized. So we have kind of plant-based diets that are based on the Mediterranean diet as the basis, or we have ones that are based on an Asian diet as the basis. And then you have some countries whose diet is inherently quite plant-based, like India, for example, has very, very low meat consumption levels globally. So this is possible to do on low incomes, and there's examples of it being done. The problem is when it gets to adoption of more westernized patterns of eating, and many countries don't want to adopt those patterns, so there's lots of examples of how this can be done. We recently conducted an analysis of China as an example of a transition economy that's gone from relatively low meat consumption, projected to have quite high meat consumption in future. And we had a look at the dietary recommendations there and found basically the amount of animal protein being currently recommended in the national dietary guidelines is really closely approximates that in the Eat Lancet planetary health diet, because the way that the diet is innately structured has a lot less meat and very, very much less dairy, so it's a lot more innately sustainable. So there is ways of achieving a sustainable diet without it being an issue of inequality, but it is contingent on factors like having the research available for different cultural contexts, promoting diets that are culturally appropriate, and presuming people have the skills to produce them.
If I can, I was also thinking of that same paper, Sophie, about affordability of Eat Lancet. And one of the interesting things in that paper that got slightly lost in some of the headlines is just how expensive meat is. So there are some people that can't even afford that tiny amount of meat in the diet. And actually most protein-rich plants like pulses, I think even nuts might have been cheaper than meat. So actually, if you're thinking about protein, then eating a more sustainable diet, money-wise, is cheaper. The other really key thing was the affordability of fruit and veg, and whether you're a carnivore or a vegan, like you have to have plenty of fruit and veg in your diet. That's really important. So I think a really big question, how do we scale up sustainably production of fruit and veg for the many countries like the UK where we're not eating enough? But I think the idea that sustainability is always more expensive is happily not true in many cases.
Brilliant, thank you. We're hastening towards a finish, but I'd just like to pick up on another question that's come in about the UK emphasis on horticultural produce grown on lowland peat, and I guess that also could tie in with a little bit about nature-based solutions. But can I, Sarah, you had some interesting facts on the areas of land needed for food production and so on. Oh my word.
Well, I just thought it'd be useful to share this image, which came from the fantastic National Food Strategy by Henry Dimbleby and Co., which was commissioned by the government as an independent review. And I mean, this obviously isn't showing, it's caused some controversy because people are like, well, that's not exactly where the food is being grown, but it's supposed to illustrate the actual, you know, the area of land, not where the stuff is being grown. So I think it's really helpful to really get a picture of how much of the UK is being used for pasture at the moment, and also to be aware that we're actually using a lot of land overseas for producing food as well, and that shows you the area of pasture land overseas which is being used to produce the food consumed in the UK. And so actually, if we're talking about you know, reducing the amount of meat and animal products that we're eating, then we do indeed need to increase the amount of land that's being used for plant-based produce. But actually, if you look at some of this land being used to produce plants, a large, you know, a significant amount of that is being used to produce cereals to feed to animals, for example. So when you do the sums, it really isn't an issue, and I hope that this graph helps to illustrate that.
Okay, thanks. Adam, you're closely associated with a large group in your department working on peatland production and so on, and minimizing greenhouse gas emissions. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, farming on peatlands massively detrimental to the environment. It releases a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, well, carbon emissions. And I think that there's for two reasons. Number one, peatlands, when they aren't drained, are a natural carbon sink. Plants grow, they photosynthesize, they die, that carbon doesn't decompose, and so it builds up. So when you're draining a peatland, you're reducing its capacity to sequester carbon. Now then, when you start cultivating on a peatland, you begin to disrupt the carbon. It becomes exposed to oxygen. Decomposition takes place. So you then increase the emissions. So you sort of are losing on both ends. And as a consequence, peatland restoration is actually one of the big nature-based solutions that I think pretty unequivocally will be a net win for greenhouse gas emissions. And we've seen, I mean, in the UK, obviously, the draining of peatlands has been very severe in the area of the country that we live in the Fens. But in other parts of the world, it's extent and impactful extent for greenhouse gases, like in Southeast Asia, oil palm plantations, for example. So I think, yes, it's very important, but it's certainly not just a UK specific problem. And there's a lot of different management things that you can do to try to reduce those emissions, like re-wetting peatlands. There you get a pulsed increase in methane that takes a while for the carbon dioxide drawdown to balance out. But for the most part, it's peatland restoration is a net positive for the climate.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Well, I should just put a plug in for our University of Cambridge Conservation Research Institute, who with their director, David Coombs, they're associated with a major project on evaluating greenhouse gas emissions from peatlands and peatland production, and trying to find the best balance to get that production together with minimizing emissions. So, I mean, I think we should try to pull this together. I'd like to thank all those who've asked questions. There's a couple here. There's one about why we don't grow more legumes in the UK. Very good question. More research needs to be done in breeding appropriate legumes, and also adapting those that have traditionally been grown in much hotter and drier conditions that are able to manage in the rather changeable UK climate. and their breeding systems. Another question: why don't we cook anymore? I think Sarah, were you waving your can of beans around? I'm not sure that's entirely gives us the right idea from our panel of experts, but nonetheless.
Well, I'd like to push back on that, because I think if you look at where we produce food, actually, if we all separately cook our meals, it's actually not particularly efficient and not good for climate change.
Okay, so we're there, but I think what I'd like to say first of all is the conclusions I can see is that one major plea we've had from the panel or reflection from the panel is that we as scientists are not doing enough to educate, to promote, to provide outputs that are digestible, sorry, pardon the expression, pardon the pun, for both politicians and graspable by the general public, to appreciate that steps can be taken, things can be done that won't cost too much, but they will make a change, and they will make a slow but progressive stepwise towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions and achieving net zero. So we all should be trying to act. And I guess the other challenge that came out partly from the discussions and so on is that we do have an election coming forward. This is not a political broadcast. We know there will be an election in the next 15 months or so. Use your vote and discuss with those politicians and ask them what policies they are, but be it at a local or a national level, what would they espouse in order to bring about net zero? Do they recognize the challenge that climate change will bring to society as a whole, not just in the UK, but globally as a whole? So I think those are two really important things that we can all take away, despite the rather sort of the fact that we're worried about our ability to reach net zero by 2050. There are many things we can be doing. So I'd like to thank our wonderful panel who have given us so many tremendous insights: Sophie Atwood, Adam Pellegrini, Emma Garnett, and Sarah Bridle. I'd like to thank the organisers, Francesca and Abigail, and for inviting us and making this whole presentation possible. And thanks to you, the audience, for being both very active in your participation in the questioning and giving us much more food for thought than perhaps we had at the start. So thanks to everybody, and good night.